so that we could maintain some communication link. Again, as we said earlier, it's so hard not to take this illness personally. When she accused me of stealing her money, initially I was very angry. And I realized that's not my wife, that's the illness, because there was never any distrust between us at any time. So to suddenly being accused of these things was kind of tough at first. There's something called fiblets. Fiblets are things that you say just to keep the peace. So when Jeannie would say, I want to go visit my parents today, rather than say, no, they're dead, there's no way you can visit them, I'd say, well, let's do this, we're right in the middle of doing this. When we're done with this, we can go visit your family, knowing that 5 minutes from now, she's not going to remember that at all. That was very difficult for me. I'd never had to lie to my wife, but just to keep the peace and keep her in good stead, it was easier just to do little fiblets about things.
And let me add this one piece. Often, if someone with Alzheimer's is asking for their parents or to go home, there's an underlying emotion.
Yeah.
So you're wanting to respond to that emotion. If someone's asking for their parents or they're wanting to go home, they might have a physical need that they're not aware of. They might be hungry, they might need to go to the bathroom, they might be uncomfortable, or they might just feel emotionally insecure. So if you respond to that emotion by any kind of positive redirection, offering a glass of water, getting up and taking a walk, that's pretty common. And what I'm impressed with is that you have certainly some training and experience with this, but little by little what you noticed was just by Jeannie's response. When you noticed an escalation in her stress, you would back off. So that's what we call validation rather than reality orientation. But you just kind of picked up on it. And not to say, I mean, it's very common for people to ask for their parents. And I mean, I feel that from time to time myself, that I would just like to be able to just go home again. I could be sitting in my living room when I feel it. Just noticing that feeling is something that you just naturally picked up on. But I also wonder, you must have had that feeling from time to time yourself, that you wanted that comfort, and were you still in the one-on-one therapy? I know you weren't in the support group.
I stayed with one-on-one right until the day she went into the nursing home. And then just recently I went back into some therapy as well. And
you were working, so that gave you some socialization.
But more lessons that I learned. There were 2 instances in 8 years where I was very tired, I was very stressed. She would sit there and keep asking the same question over and over again, and twice I lost it. And I said, well, I've just told you that 5 different times, you're not listening to me, and I just would explode. And then as soon as I would say this, Jeannie would start crying because she upset me. And I would start crying because I just yelled at my wife who has this terrible illness. And I was told that you have to remember that you're only human. And it's okay to experience this stuff as long as it's not a pattern, it's part of life. So that was a very, very tough one. A huge lesson that I learned is how essential it is for a person with Alzheimer's to have a dedicated advocate, to have someone who can buffer all the bureaucracies and medical people to take care of. I know my wife's needs far better than any physician. An example, she had a heart attack. She ended up down at Bay State. The cardiologist came into the room and said, well, it appears that your wife is having a heart attack, and I'm going to be doing a bypass surgery. And I questioned this doctor, and I said, well, I don't know where you're basing this on. You haven't diagnosed it. She's had no angiogram. So what are you basing this on? I said, do you know her health history? Do you think, how well will she recover from such a thing? And he said, well, you're talking like you're a doctor. I said, no, I'm not a doctor, but I had bypass surgery, and I know how it knocked the stuffing out of me, and I don't think my wife would survive. But more importantly, step 1, doctor, is find out what the problem is before you start coming up with a solution. He was very upset. They ended up doing an angiogram, found out all she needed was a stent, and that was the end of it. But unfortunately, I had to intervene on several occasions. For example, when the psychiatrist was just so blasé about this diagnosis, we fired him. We found someone else. My philosophy is if you're charging me for your services, that makes you my employee. And if you can't provide the services I need, you're fired and I'll just find someone else to fill in that slot. I guess that's possibly where some of the social work comes into effect. Again, it is essential that you know that you cannot possibly do this on your own. 40% of Alzheimer's caregivers die before the patient dies because of the stress, because of completely forgetting your needs and devoting yourself to the other person. It would have been wonderful if I had family support. I couldn't count on that. I was able to find a lot of external support. We developed a team over time of about a dozen different people who provided different services for my wife. And if this one didn't work out, we'd find someone else to bring into the house.
One thing that I find surprising is that you did this with one caregiver, one personal care attendant. So what happened if your caregiver couldn't be there?
That never, I take that back. Our caregiver found a friend of hers, two friends of hers, who if Dory couldn't make it, one or two of her friends could come in at the last minute. There was one occasion in all this time where we could get no one. I just called off sick that day and spent the day with my wife alone.
But something that we also know from experience is that really it takes a whole team.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's a tough one because the family, the individual with the diagnosis really doesn't want a lot of different faces. So in a home care situation, we would often be asked, why do we have to have so many different people?
Yeah.
But you were very fortunate. You were very fortunate that you had someone who was that reliable. And sometimes even the best laid plans, people who intend to be reliable, stuff happens. So I think I would always recommend having a backup, and the backup person has to be familiar with what's going on.
Yep.
So did you keep any kind of log book or some kind of communication?
Yep, Dory and I had a journal that we would each write notes to each other back and forth. Prior to her going on vacation, her friend came over and spent 2 or 3 different days with Jeannie, with Dory, with me, so that Jeannie became familiar with that person, so it wasn't just suddenly a new face. Changes had to be very slow and very thought out.
And I think that I know that it's very important for the individual to have some kind of meaningful activity that that doesn't overstimulate. And I know that you've told me that Dory was able to figure that out.
Well, we did a few things. Jeannie had mentioned many times that she was lacking purpose. And I've known through the work I've done in the past how essential it is for people to have purpose. So one of the things we were able to do is get her to volunteer at the Coleraine School to read to the preschool kids. And once a week for an hour, Dory would take her to school. Jeannie would read to these little kids and felt wonderfully satisfied. They sent her a beautiful plaque at the end of the year thanking her with all the kids' pictures and signatures on it. And it was just a wonderful moment of pride. Jeannie had a huge collection of both Hummels and Angels. And Dory realized that a way to keep Jeannie busy is immediately after lunch, while Jeannie's still sitting at the table, for Dory to bring in a tray of Angels and some cleaning tools. And Jeannie would spend the whole afternoon just cleaning each of these figures very thoroughly, and just felt wonderful about that she was able to do things around the house. She was never a domestic queen. Most of what happened, I did. So this, again, gave her some things that she could be doing, and she had a lot of pride with her work. She was very proud of her collection.
And that's something that now we call habilitation rather than rehabilitation, just providing the person with the opportunity to stay engaged in life, in meaningful activity, whatever that might be. It might be folding. It's an activity that I've found that works, folding or sorting. And you know, it doesn't, and thanking and be, you know, it's pretty basic stuff, but being able to feel like you're contributing and that you're able to successfully accomplish the task and that you're contributing something meaningful. Even if then after it's folded, you can go in the other room and mess it up again and they could fold some more. It's not, it is, the idea is to do something that's within your capacity and it's meaningful. And again, you just, I'm all about the training, but yet I am ever impressed with the fact that you figured it all out, just trial and error.
Should be handy to have a rule book, I'll tell you. More lessons learned. One of the biggest lessons for me to learn was patience. Because you need to have the patience of a saint. It was so hard for her to do things, and things that normally she could do easily were now taking 3 or 4 times longer to do. And it was essential that she be able to do these unless she asked for help. I mean, your impulse as a caregiver is to jump in and do it for her. Mm-hmm. And I realized very early on that that's not serving her whatsoever. It's actually diminishing her. So it was essential to keep her included in as much decision making as possible, to let her do as many things independently that she could possibly do, not have her, not set her up for failure by asking her to make a 5-course dinner, but maybe she could peel the potatoes while I'm preparing something else. Mm-hmm. And she felt included and felt purposeful, and that's huge.
And you got to grow a little skill yourself in patience.
I took my final examination. I took her to buy a pair of shoes. Now, in the past, I would drop her off at the shoe store. I'd be gone for an hour, hour and a half, come back, and she'd narrowed it down to maybe 5 pairs. And she would ultimately buy the shoes. Well, after she went into the nursing home, I went shoe shopping with her, and I sat next to her for an hour and a half while she tried on every pair of sneakers that they had in the store. And I just patiently sat there, and I really almost broke my arm patting myself on the back that I'd graduated in the course of patience. Something else that's absolutely essential is the importance of touch. People, as they get older, tend to become more socially isolated. And just something simple, just me putting my hand on her hand or my hand on her arm. In her case, I would hug her a lot. But you just watch her melt at the impact of a touch. So important. What I found in Jeannie's case, this is not universal with all people with Alzheimer's, but in many cases, their brain is slowly rewinding. And we've all heard stories of how they no longer recognize their daughter. They think it's their mother or their aunt. Mm-hmm. As someone would regress to where they're now, instead of in their 70s, they're back to their 30s. Well, this woman walking in who's 45 couldn't possibly be my daughter because I'm 15 years younger than she, therefore she's my mother, she's my aunt, she's someone older. So trying to understand that part of it was challenging. In Jeannie's case, emotions were the very last thing to go. Logic at this point was pretty much shot toward the end. But her feelings were always there. And something that you taught me is that although she might not remember me visiting her, she's going to remember the feeling that she had while we were together, and those feelings would linger. And so my goal was to just get her as happy as possible whenever I'd see her, so she'd have a smile on her face and a song in her heart. And those feelings would continue.
And I think what's important for a caregiver to know that when you put yourself in that positive frame of mind to give that positive energy to the individual, you kind of get it yourself.
Oh, absolutely.
You walk out the door, maybe of something you were dreading doing, but you find that you've got a little skip in your step, and that same energy has kind of come back. And also another thing I think that's important is, I think about the chin, where, not talking to your chin, getting to the level, not just touch, but getting to the level where you're not standing over a person, talking down to them.